Hey everybody, this is Dowden. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make music in the style of Dmitry Molosh. Dmitry was a heavily requested video. Just look at all these comments right here. So if you watched any of my other how to make music like videos, you'll know I usually start from the ground up and write the track. But this time I wanted to try and refine the track a lot more and have a higher quality project file for you to download. So please let me know if you like this format. You can download the project in the link in the description below. Make sure to subscribe. Let's get into the video. So for this progressive house driving track, it's 122 beats per minute. The key is in D sharp minor. The track is already mixed with a limiter on the master to give it that full volume to let you hear what it kind of sounds like when it's fully finished. I'm going to go through each individual channel and show you what I did, how I did it, and why I did it. So starting with the drums first, I have my kick drum, and the kick drum is two different channels. It's the high end, cutting out all that low end, kind of scooping out some of this muddiness, and cutting off a little bit of the high end because I don't need it so clicky at the top. And then I have this sub frequency kick, which is just the sub frequencies. I have the low end in mono, and then this EQ is just pushing up a little bit of the mid section to give it a little bit more beef and power in the mids. This compressor here is just slightly compressing to give it a bit more punchiness. That's why I have a fast to medium attack here. It's just missing the beginning of the kick and allowing it to punch through a little bit more. And this limiter is here just to grab the peaks at the top of the kick. So I just pulled the ceiling down until I kind of heard that the kick was changing in sound, and then I backed off until I couldn't hear the change anymore. This is just to kind of clean up the kick and any of the sharp peaks that are getting through that are going to throw off the mix and master. If you don't really know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It's not really that important. It's just something I like to do to kind of clean up my mix. Moving on to the rest of the drums. With Dmitry Molosh's tracks, there's a lot of hooks usually going on in the drums as well as in the bass lines and in the percussion and melody. So the whole track is usually full of catchy rhythmic elements that really complement each other and kind of keep the track as interesting as possible without adding too many more layers to the track. You can listen to it for a long time and it doesn't get boring because there's so many little things going on. Keeping that in mind as I go through the instruments. So with the drums, starting with, I have some shakers here. Quite a bit of movement going on. I have the 16th shakers, the upbeat shakers, and then the swing shakers. I named them these because the 16ths are playing on all the 16ths, which gives you that really strong shakery feel. The upbeat is playing on kind of like the upbeat of the sound. And then the swing is there to add a bit of flair and movement to the sound and make it not so repetitive and boring. So adjusting the velocity and trying to make these kind of work together in a way that is going to make the shakers feel more interesting, but also feels like it's cohesive and working together. The 16ths have the has effect on them, which is just a stereo spread. So it plays from the left and the right speaker with a delay in between them, which makes it feel very wide. And then I have sidechain compression on the 16ths. So when the kick is playing, it's kind of ducking down and creating that nice groove. Combining that with the velocity gives it that sense of pulsing, which really helps keep the groove going. And then I have the upbeat also with the has effect, but I've chosen a little bit wider of a has effect. And so that it's going from the left to the right over a longer period of time. And then I have the swing with some reverb on that to kind of soften it a little bit. And then I have some left-right EQ and some mid-side EQ. So the left-right is actually widening the signal as well by pushing down certain frequencies in the left and then pushing them up in the high frequencies in the left, and then vice versa on the right. So part of the hat kind of goes in the left speaker and part of the hat goes in the right. And then the mid-side EQ is there to kind of boost up the width of the sound more. And then just some other EQ, taming some of those high frequencies that are kind of bulking up too much in the high end, making it a little bit too sharp. A lot of Dmitry's tracks have really powerful hi-hats as well, so I chose this big layered hi-hat because it really helps push that top end up. A lot of his hi-hats are pretty open sounding and pretty aggressive, which also increases that perceived tempo, the feeling of the increased energy, even though it's not that fast of a track. So if you feel like you want to increase that power or that energy of the track, try a more aggressive hi-hat. I have 4 hats here. I have a main punch, a sharp punch, open width, and open centered. Lots of layers going into this. There's a lot of power behind this hi-hat. It's very present in the track, but competing with the quality of Dmitry Molosh's tracks, I really wanted to make sure that I added a lot of layers to really make the track feel nice and full. So with these hats, I have them just slightly offset every single hit. They're just a little bit different every time, which is gonna make the track feel a little bit more humanized, more realistic, and add more to the swing. Take a listen to those. And then I have the main punch. I faded out a little bit of the waveform so that it's not so long. And then I have the sharp punch, really sharp, just getting that initial transient punch through and really help it punch through the mix. The open width, I have some has effect on it, making it feel nice and wide. And then the open center, I don't have any stereo imaging on it. And it's just playing more centered down the mix so that it still sounds good in mono. I can even put a little bit of panning on some of them. Sure, that sounds good. And then I have a saturator at the end of the chain. Again, taking out a little bit of that sharpness around 10K. I find that layering up, especially hats, gets very bulky around there. So I want to kind of cut that out. The saturator works as a compressor, as in it's reducing dynamic range. So adding that saturator kind of just glues all those drums together and makes them feel more powerful. Very subtle, but it kind of just beefs them up a bit. Moving on to the clap. So this clap here is just one single clap. I didn't think that I needed a ton of layers for the clap. This one just did the trick perfectly. I took the initial transient off the clap because I like the way that it sounds better like this. So if we listen, just a little bit shorter, more to the point, and not so kind of like crunchy and long. I just put some saturation on it, some EQ. Saturation bulks it up a little bit, makes it a bit crunchier, and the EQ is there just to kind of cut out those low frequencies that I don't really need with the clap. It might sound a little thin right now with the EQ on, but you have to remember that when you're playing your clap, it's usually playing over top of other instruments, especially your kick drum, where you do have typically a lot of information around here. With the kick on, it doesn't seem like you're losing that power behind the clap. And then I have some movement on the clap as well, but I do think it's a little bit too much. So I'm just going to move that back and move this one back a little bit. That's better. I have 4 percussive elements here, and the trick with this is that I'm putting these elements kind of randomly in the loop so that the loop feels interesting for a longer period of time, but they're also in places that make sense and complement the groove. So I'm not just grabbing and dropping them wherever, I'm actually choosing where they are working well with the rest of the drums. So let's take a listen to all these drums together and we can look at the MIDI. Right, so they're not just randomly placed, like they have a purpose and they feel groovy and like they're adding to the groove in the track. There's a snare, a bigger snare, and then a vinyl snare. The vinyl snare is pushed up 7 semitones. It's just there to give it some extra little ear candy that is more so in the background, but it keeps the loop interesting. Not hard to do, just take your time with it and just choose places that add to the groove and aren't just taking away. I have this main percussion here, and this is very Dmitry Molosh style, having like a driving percussion that is catchy and is like a main hook. I added it to the track, but it was kind of busying up the track a lot, so whether you like it or not is up to you. I'll leave it in for this example. It's just a bongo that I've taken the pitch up. I actually had it lower with this on, but it was just too messy in the track, so I put it up the other octave, and I have a velocity tool on there, adding a bit of randomness to the velocity. This EQ is pushing up the actual key of the key frequency. So this is pushing up the D sharp so that it has that pitch to help it kind of push through the track and have some actual tone to it and some pitch to it. Tuner here to make sure that it's in key. I have my gate. So the sound itself is a little messy, so a little long, so I put the gate to kind of clean up the tail a little bit. A limiter as well to push it up, since it's so percussive and transient. I use the limiter to kind of push up the lower part to the sound and cut off the top, and it just feels more full and less percussive. And then the has effect. This is a tricky subject because percussive elements like this that are very hard hitting and transient, they can actually run into problems with the has effect because it will actually double up the sound when you go into mono. So listen to this. You know, it's like doubling up. That's why I kept it really low, and I check here in mono. So I had it at 13.5. It's just enough that even in mono, it sounds like one sound. And then I'm panning a little bit to the left because this sample is already panned to the right. But if you are going to use the has effect or stereo delay or a widener on a percussive element, make sure to check in mono as well that you're not doubling up and it doesn't sound weird or that it's, causing any problems. Conga, and then after the conga, we're going to take a listen to all the drums with the kick drum as well. I found that in a lot of Dmitry's tracks, there was almost always something that was high-end and percussive. Either a clave, a bongo, a conga, something that was just giving a little bit more pitch and tonality to the high end as well in the drums. So I chose this conga, and it's a really nice sounding conga, and I just put that in just to complement the groove even more. And I just made sure it was in the right pitch. And let's take a listen to all the drums, including the kick. These will be a little louder. It stays interesting and it keeps the momentum going with just the drums that I have here. Lastly, I'm going to put a glue compressor on the drum bus just to compress a little bit on the drums, just to get 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction. My clap is really transient here. Maybe I'll turn my dry wet down a little bit, and then I'll just push this up by about maybe 2 dB. I'll put my attack up a little bit more so I'm not getting so much of that clap. Much better. And then finally, I have return tracks. And in these return tracks, I have a reverb for the drums. And then I have what's called New York compression. And I should actually turn that off. So I have my high cut off. I have just about a second of decay time. I have my different instruments being sent with this A send here. Very subtle. And then I have what's called New York or parallel compression in this channel here. I'm not going to dive into what New York compression is. You can check out this video right here where I talk about New York compression. But basically, it's just overcompressing the hell out of a sound and then introducing that signal back into the original sound with just a little bit of volume to really beef up the sound. It works really good for drums by giving you a sense of more volume, even though you're not really turning them up all that much. So main takeaways for the drums is you want them to be super catchy. You want to have a lot of little hits going on, percussion instruments going on, and you want them to be groovy and Everything you add, you want to be complementing the groove, encouraging the groove, using hooks, simple ideas. Basic rule of thumb is when you play it with the kick, does it sound catchy and groovy? And you can layer up quite a few of those instruments, but you don't want it to be too busy either, because then you kind of lose a sense of the groove overall. Now I'm going to move on to the bass elements of the track. So I have quite a few elements of bass. Sub is driving in a lot of Dmitry's tracks, which gives it a sense of perceived tempo, making it feel faster and more energetic, even though the tempo might not be that fast. Even some of his tracks that are 120 beats per minute feel like peak time, high energy tracks, and a lot of it has to do with this idea of this driving sub frequency. So if I look at the sub, there is not a lot of empty space. And if we imagine that the kick drum is on every one of these notes, there's not a lot of emptiness in between, which gives it that sense of increased energy. I'd like to have, for my faster bass lines, less empty space. We'll listen to the sub with the kick. It feels driving, it feels rolling. There's not a bunch of gaps in between, which can cause it to feel a little bit less rolling and a little bit slower. It's just a basic sine wave, lowered an octave in here. There's nothing else going on except for some sidechain compression. And I'm compressing pretty heavily because this is a sub frequency and I don't want any overlap basically in my low end from the kick and the sub. Going up to the bass now, it's the same MIDI, just a little bit higher for the from the sub, except I also have notes on the downbeat here, the first beat, and the third beat here. And this is playing at the same time as the kick, but I do have some side chaining going on, and we can take a listen to that with the kick. Maybe a little bit too much side chain, I'll bring that back a bit. And then EQ, I'm taking out the low end, so I'm removing that crunchy bit. If I listen to just that, I'm removing kind of that mid crunch that is just kind of making it too powerful of a sound that's taking up space for a lot of the other instruments that I want to bring in. So if I just turn that off and on, you can hear what I mean. Just feels a little bit cleaner with that crunchiness out and then cutting off the high end. I don't need that high buzziness in the bass because I have other instruments that are going to be filling that area in the frequency spectrum. Going back to the sound itself, I have this wavetable with a sawtooth wave, lots of harmonics with sawtooth waves. I use them for a lot of my basses. Velocity tool on the cutoff. In the MIDI area here, on filter 1 frequency, which is the same frequency, I'm using the velocity in the MIDI information to open and close that pluck, and I'm using this random parameter to make it randomized. So this random is going to just push open and close that filter a little bit more as the track is playing. So if we pay attention to that, I can push this up really high. You can hear how it sounds. And if I go back to 15, maybe even 20 might be a little bit better. It's just adding a little bit of randomness to the sound, making it more interesting to the listener and less repetitive. Moving on to the next layer of bass, I have this top bass. It's not that interesting on its own, but adding this bit of delay gives a rolling sense of groove. Along with the kick. Again, just choosing a place that is adding to the groove of the song. And I have on this just a simple sawtooth. Again, I've pushed up the resonance a little bit to give it a bit more of a punchiness. Matrix pushing up the filter 1 frequency, again using envelope 2 to control how the cutoff works to make a pluck. And then I have it lowered an octave in here to get it a little bit lower, of course. And then the LFO is where this adds even more movement to the sound. LFO is going to be moving back and forth. I have the retrigger turned off so that every time it hits, it's going to continue following the LFO and not just restart every time. LFO is controlling the filter 1 frequency, so it's opening and closing this very little by just a little bit. And then the oscillator 1 position is also moving. Just again, giving some movement to keep the sounds professional and interesting sounding. It's not hard to add a little bit of variation, and it goes a long way. We want the listener to feel subconsciously interested. We want them to feel like this 7-8 minute long track is still interesting from start to finish. And this is the way to do that. Then I have some voices and a little bit of unison, just a little bit to make it feel a little bit wider. If I turn that off, it's way more interesting with that bit of unison, but it is a low sound, so I want to add some mid-side EQ after the reverb, because reverb adds stereo imaging and stereo width, and I want to go to mid-side, and I want to cut out the side information of that sound up till about 1 or 200 at least. Now I don't have to worry so much about the sides kind of coming together and going into mono and causing problems with the mix. Cutting out the low end, of course, of the sound. I already have quite a bit of low end going on in the track. I don't need that. And then I have this side chain from bass accent. So the bass accent is down here, and that's actually a different sound that's playing, and it's overlapping with this top bass. So instead of side chaining from the kick, I've sidechained from this bass accent, and we'll get to that sound in just a few minutes here. Just making room for it so that it doesn't overlap too much in the mix. Let's take a listen to all three of these now. The bass feels full, it feels groovy, but it's rolling and it has a decent amount of energy as well. Perc bass top. This is just a preset that I grabbed, synthetic kick bass trap. It's in Ableton, and I just threw a delay on it and cut out almost all of that low end, and this is what it sounds like. I just copied the MIDI information of the bass, and it's just there to add a little bit of a percussive hit to the top of the bass. I like that percussive sound, so I just added delay and cut out that low end. Just complements the top bass a little bit. Just more ear candy to make that bass line even more interesting. Then I have this bass accent, so this is what I was talking about overlapping with the top bass, and it sounds like this. Slightly different velocity. And the sound itself is just a sawtooth with FM in the settings down here. So from none, I went to FM. I changed the tuning and the amount. So without the amount, it's just a sawtooth wave. It's actually just a duplicate of this top bass here. I have on the matrix some filter 1 frequency on LFO 1. So it's going to be opening and closing that LFO, as well as turning up and down the volume. The tuning to 52% and the amount to 60. So if I change that tuning, you'll notice that it starts to sound out of tune. So you want to make sure that you're finding the right tuning with this FM style synthesis right here. Just by scrolling up and down until it sounds in tune. It's just lowered by 2 octaves, so I get this nice, really low, gritty sound. And then again, playing with the top bass, and you'll hear kind of why I decided to sidechain it. You can watch the sidechain here. So they are playing over top of each other, so I just decided to duck one of them out of the way and let that more powerful one kind of overcome the more softer top bass. Basically it for the bass, we have one more sound, which is just this bass accent with 100% of the amount. And I don't think anything else is different on here, and it just sounds like this. And the reason I added these little stabs is because in Dmitry's music, there's a lot of little one-shot or kind of random hits of bass that come in that really elevate the bass loop and make it feel more interesting and keep the listener engaged. And so I noticed in a lot of his tracks, he does this kind of like uplifting one where it'll play like a lower note and then go higher. And it sounds a little bit cheesy, but it just kind of like makes it more fun, I guess. I don't know. I noticed it in a lot of his tracks, and the way he does it works really well. It's really hard to compete with Dmitry. His stuff is top quality and right up my alley, so hard to compete. Lastly, on the bass group, I have an EQ, which is automated, which I'll explain later, and then some multi-band compression on the lows, mids, and highs, just to clean it up a little bit. Not really even that obvious. Just makes the low end feel a little bit more present. And then I have some sidechain compression on the entire bass bus, just like 2 or 3 dB. Just to make sure that the kick is still punching through everything. And to keep in mind that this does add more compression onto the things that are already compressed. So moving on to the synths now. So with Dmitry's stuff, there's usually really interesting kind of background things going on. A lot of the track really relies on the driving elements, the bass line and the percussion, but there are some really cool synths that really help elevate the tracks. Sometimes a really nice lead that comes through to kind of tie the track together. With this style of progressive house, there's usually quite a bit of atmosphere, but you don't want to take away from the main groove of the tracks usually. So even though there is typically atmosphere and melody, they are complementary to the groove. So there's a lot of subtleties and things that kind of go a little bit more in the background of the song. And then there is usually just 1 or 2 things that kind of come to the foreground, maybe a lead or an arp, but focusing on the more kind of background stuff, I have a couple pads that are actually quite interesting and they were a little bit unique to make, so I really wanted to show you how I did it. So I'm going to show you how I made this Catchy Pad. If you don't have Serum or if you don't have anything that I use in this track, I will be freezing and flattening these into the audio versions as well, so you can still access these if you download the project files. So first I have this Catchy Pad, which is a preset in Serum. It's just one of the sequencers. It's a unique sound. It's not really going to work well with this track, but then I threw on Valhalla Supermassive, which is this like big reverb algorithmic delay tool thing. It adds a ton of space and reverberations and everything to the sound, which makes it really cool. So what I did with that is I EQ'd a lot of that out. I recorded that by freezing and flattening the track, and then I ended up with this right here. So now it has like this rhythm. It's just, I've taken a part of this delayed signal and I've turned it into this rhythmic type of pad. And then I went in further, I cut out just the beginning of the sound. So I just have the beginning looping over and over, and then I have increased the pitch of that by a full octave, and it sounds like this. And then adding a delay makes it even more loose and full of movement. And just adding this in with the rest of the instruments, it just sounds really cool. The main point I'm trying to make is that you can get these really cool pads like this by just resampling and kind of structuring them into a rhythmic element, or just taking them and throwing a bunch of reverb on them, resampling them, and then turning that into a pad. Even if it's something like a sequence or a chord progression, it's a great way to enhance your pads to be more of like a hovering background sound than just something to kind of fill up the empty space. It can add a lot of dynamics and a lot of interest to your tracks. Next, I did the same thing with this Seashore Pad. So it's Seashore Pad. I think it's a preset inside of Ableton, and it just sounds like this. So I just grabbed an EQ, threw it on there, grabbed a reverb, threw it on there, turned up the decay time really high, and then just recorded that. So audio track, resample, and then just recorded what that sounded like. And now that I have this section, I can just duplicate that over a bunch of times, and I've just created a pad. Cross it over to get rid of the clicks. It's a great way to up your pad game and create some really unique sounds. Just using some automation to open that filter cutoff up. It's just a basic pluck, sawtooth wave. I have a second oscillator that's lowered an octave that's closer to the triangle, because I find that when you're adding lower octaves of the sawtooth, it gets really gritty. So by pushing it down a little bit, I get more of a soft sound. layering that up with the higher octave. And then just adding a sharp pluck, so 600 milliseconds of decay time, no sustain, and just pushing that up on the filter gives me that nice pluck sound. Again, it's just a duplicate of the bass. That's why I have these voices and detune the same settings. I could even push this up a little bit, make it even wider sounding. Very simple to do, just create a pluck. And then adding a bit of delay, some EQ. So this EQ is cutting out the lows. It sounds a little weak on its own, but again, it's going to be covered with a lot of other instruments, so I don't need that low end. Reverb erosion, that's adding a bit of grit. I wanted this to sound just a little bit different, not typical pluck every single time. So just adding something like an erosion can help it stand out and feel a little bit more unique and interesting. And then just simple melody, staying with that D sharp, playing a simple melody, and then the delay kind of helps fill up that empty space. Moving on to the synthetic string pad. This is actually an Ableton preset, super nice sounding strings. And I just went in and just played 2 chords back and forth, and I made them so they're not totally on the grid, so they feel like they're kind of moving, and it makes it feel like more of a journey of a song. I could even move this more if I wanted to, just to make it not so on the grid and more unique, and it just feels like it's a little bit more of like a soundscape. Played that along through the breakdown. I also added a big feedback on the preset. So all I did was take this echo out of the preset pack that was here, and I increased the feedback and the dry wet a little bit, so it would have, again, some more movement and distance and space. These are really fun to make. So you just have to grab any synth that you want, Serum, Wavetable, Pigments, anything you want, and just throw on Supermassive. This is free, by the way. Supermassive is free. I'll put the link to that in the description below, and it is a great tool to add tons of movement onto your sounds. So I can just play a single note and adds a huge delay and reverb to it. But then on top of that, I've also added Supermassive, which isn't free, but is really, really nice. And you can use any reverb for this, but this is just gonna give a nice shimmery reverb. And what that does is it creates this huge atmospheric sound, and I just chose a random sound. Like, this sounds good on basically anything. If Pigments would hurry up and open, I could show you. Okay, so I choose BFG lead, and without the reverbs, it doesn't sound that good, but with the reverbs, it's this huge sound. So just try it on random presets inside of there, and you can get some really cool stuff. I have another preset here that I chose. And again, I'll be freezing these so that you can use them even if you don't have Pigments. Bent Pluck. Let's hear how that sounds on its own. Just EQing out some low end and the resonant frequency. It's like a weird, like, whoa, boom. Atmosphere. Lastly, I have a wavetable that is just adding a bit of a slower, like a quick to a slow attack, and it just sounds really nice. And that's hitting on the actual drop, and then when that plays, that just gives that drop like a nice presence when it actually hits. So if you listen to it with the bass, basically take a listen to everything here. It's nice for transitions. Moving on to the effects, I have this white noise. So this is just Operator, which is a synth in Ableton, and then I have a utility to control the volume and some EQ on the low and high passes. And then the volume is automated to control the actual volume of the white noise. So as the white noise is playing, the gain turns up my white noise, and then I use these EQs parameters, these filters to move it back and forth. Push up the parameter a little bit on that. We get this nice rising white noise, and my EQ opens and closes to make some movement. And then some reverb. Very simple. Some impacts I have, just crashes with lots of reverb and delay. But I filtered out the top end of the delay, so it's just like that low mid section that's kind of coming through. Otherwise, it sounds too obvious that you're repeating it. So I like having just the lows come through. And then I've recorded some of these and turned them into much longer kind of builders with some auto pan. And the auto pan is actually increasing with the automation. So I'll go over the automation after, but these are just there to kind of break up the track and transition into the next parts. These are actually really important to keeping the track feel like it's moving along. So putting these every 32 or 64 beats with some impacts and then having those atmospheres in between really helps. This longer impact, which I just took the recorded one and I just really stretched it out so it was very long. And then I have another impact here of a different sound, which is a snare. Snare roll, so just a basic snare sound with some reverb on it and EQing out a lot of the low end of this sound with some automation. So the snare roll itself, automation for that is just I'm increasing the volume of the automation with the snare roll. I'm increasing the filtering, so I'm cutting out the filter as it's rising and cutting out more and more of that low end, which increases the tension. And then I have the dry wet also increasing, so it becomes more full of reverb as it's kind of building. Last two elements, I have this vocal turned Atmo. This is pretty cool. I took an atmospheric sound and I added a delay onto it, pushed up the high end of that, and then I used vocoder and reverb to really push the sound into like an atmospheric sound. So let's take a listen to that. So without the EQ and the vocoder and the reverb and the delay, then the delay is 100% dry wet with a huge feedback. The EQ is pushing up just the airiness of it. The vocoder is pushing a lot of the white noise that you hear, and then the reverb is creating more of an atmosphere. And then this plugin wider is a free plugin that pushes the stereo image of it even wider. I'll also put that in the link in the description below. Last element we have is this serum. Again, I will freeze this, and this will be a riser. So I just made this riser by using a pitch shifter by KHS and just increasing that pitch as this is kind of rising up. Opening up the filter with the cutoff of the EQ. Okay, let's take a look at the actual automation of everything before we wrap up this track. So for the kick, I just have some automation on the actual kick low end itself so that it cuts out the low end and kind of transitions into other parts of the track. For the main percussion, I'm just turning it up in the build-up. So I'm using an EQ to cut out all that high end, and then I'm just EQing that filter open as it's building in the actual track. This EQ is controlling the low end of the bass. Again, just kind of builds up with the track and cuts out that low end as it's building, which increases tension because you're pulling out a lot of the energy. And then when it comes back in at full force, it's very energetic and powerful sounding. This Catchy Pad, I'm using this gain to use it as a bit of a riser. So it's increasing in volume as it's building up, which creates this nice tension build. I have lead ARP. This is the cutoff filter. I've drawn in with a pencil over here and just try to draw like a bit of a squiggly line to keep that movement of that cutoff even more, so it's opening and closing as the track's progressing. I have synthetic string pad turning up with the filter, so the filter is opening as the track is progressing, making again it feel more rising in tension. Click the link in the description below to get access to these project files, and I'll see you in one of these videos right here where I cover another style with another artist.